Well, I've come to Oxford to give a talk about One World to students and to take the chance to hear a great keynote speaker. It's all happening at the very upmarket side business school, where a weekend forum on development is being arranged by the Oxford Hub. So who are they exactly?
So we're sort of a one-stop shop for students who want to engage with the cause and make a difference. And what we do predominantly is we support all of the different charities and societies working in Oxford, whether that's UNICEF Oxford or Students Supporting Street Kids. So the various small groups that are trying to make a difference, fundraising, campaigning, sending volunteers abroad, and we try and bring them together to build the community, provide best practice resources, common resources, run events like this where they can all come together and find students who might want to get involved with their work.
And everybody certainly was getting involved. The focus of the 2 days was Africa. Just what progress are the countries of Africa making in today's globalizing world? Like everyone else, I settled down for a really detailed overview from the keynote speaker.
It relates very strongly to Africa. Africa doesn't have a seat at most of the global tables that matter. Of course, it's going to be affected by global decisions. So you have this huge imbalance in all the institutions, not least in the World Bank, where Africa now is about, I think, a third of the lending goes to Africa, and it has 2 out of the 22 board seats. Similarly, at the IMF. I didn't realize Masood's coming, but I should say hi to him. So these are very, very important issues, and of course they're going to play out very strongly on climate change as well. So that's not what I'm talking about, but what I am talking about is integration on the economic front. The very exciting thing, let me begin with the good news, because when one thinks about the world, one often, especially in development terms, can be a development pessimist, but I think it's very, very significant when one thinks about development to begin with an understanding that things have never been so good. We live in an age of the most amazing opportunity for humankind, which makes it all the more important that we commit to development and we commit to ensuring that everyone shares in this opportunity. If we were dismal about the world outlook, then we'd have to be dismal about development. But I'm not dismal about the world outlook. And one of the reasons is because I'm an optimist in general on globalization. Now, what globalization brings is this huge ability to transfer resources around the world. But it also, most excitingly, brings the transfer of ideas. So this is what globalization, more than anything else, is about, is the flow of ideas, sometimes embodied in trade, in migration, in other things, the flow of ideas. This is a simple graphic of 2 things, which is world population and world GDP, and it shows vividly a number of things. The one is we're on sort of an exponential growth path. Note these numbers here are exponential. So GDP is rising extremely rapidly, and so is population, or has been. But the other amazing thing is that there have only been 2 periods in relatively recent economic history. And economists will create graphs about anything, and they'll go back as long as you want, but 2,000 years, I think, is about as far as most people will say we have decent data sets. This is a period about 1,000 years ago where GDP growth exceeded population growth, and we've had that in the more recent period, despite the world's population going up by over 2 billion in this time. So this is very, very significant. This was a period also when the East came to the West. This was a period when the great inventions of China and India, the great thought advances, were brought to benefit mankind more broadly and led to innovation in Europe and elsewhere. And this, of course, is a similar period of mass globalization. And I would argue that the ability of GDP as a very, very crude measure of aggregate income or welfare to exceed population growth relates to this integration, the spreading of ideas and very, very rapid technological and idea change. And it's not only technologies in the sort of material sense, like getting your iPod to work or the concept of mathematics, but it's more broadly what works in terms of governance, what works in terms of macro policy, and so on. So a lot of the things we now think are absolutely something we take for granted are new. For example, we have had a huge oil price shock in recent years, particularly in recent months, with oil going up much higher than anyone would have imagined, and yet none of the destabilizing effect of the 1970s has been manifest in the global economy. What we've seen now would have led to a major global crash only 30 years ago, and that is because of a learning process which has been so widely absorbed around the world that even African economies have managed to withstand the shock. Of course, people have suffered, but it hasn't led to economic collapse. And we can come back to that. So the sort of thing that's come out of this is these absolute mammoth achievements in the history of mankind. This is even later since the 70s, after the 70s, and more like since the early 80s. But life expectancy at birth has increased by about 20 years over this period. That might not seem extraordinary, but it probably took from the Stone Age or even before to get a 20-year life expectancy. But indeed, people say that in Egypt, Pharaoh's Egypt, you had life expectancies which weren't very different to the 1600s in England. So life expectancy has not moved rapidly, but has just leaped in this period. Illiteracy in the world, which is another measure of development, which is significant, has gone down from about 50% on average to about 25% on average. And income per capita has improved to the extent that the number of absolute poor, a very crude measure, the number of people living under $1 a day, has gone down by at least 300 million, despite, and that's the really remarkable thing, the population of the world increasing by 2 billion in this time. So now, if you had sat in the 1960s and imagined this, I think you would have been thought of as some sort of person that smoked too much dope. But this is what's happened. Now, it's been hugely unequal, and of course what concerns us today is Africa. Africa has not benefited. A lot of the story is an Asian story, particularly a China and India story. Bangladesh, in some respects, particularly illiteracy, has been a remarkable one. But if one looks on aggregate, if you were sitting on as a Martian looking at the Earth's long history, this would be a wow moment and something happening moment on any term. Now, is this related to trade? There are trade fundamentalists, particularly at the World Bank and the IMF, and I think this is a very quick graph that says no. There are periods of, again, how do you measure trade? Openness, trade, this is a crude measure, this is exports over GDP as one measure of openness of an economy, and dollar poor, number of people living under $1 a day, in terms of millions of people, that's a billion over there, 1.4 billion. And what you see is an interesting thing, that at periods where countries have become more open, the number of poor have gone up. But then, since the Second World War, really, the number of people, poor has gone down with the same proportion. So there have been periods in history of increased globalization associated with increased poverty. That isn't the phenomenon that we're seeing now. What we're seeing now is increased globalization associated with very, very rapid reduction in poverty. And this has particularly been the case since, and it doesn't really show well here, since the revolutions in policy in China, which the opening up of China in many respects, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1990, marked a huge change in all sorts of things for many countries of Europe, Eastern Europe, but also for others. So Africa and Central America, for example, were captured by the Cold War in a fight between largely the US, supported by UK and others, and the Soviet Union. And their policies became captured in that war in really devastating ways, with many, many conflicts around the world associated with that.